Lovely to be with you. I hope you can all see the screen now. So this is the rather lengthy title that Greg Pritchard gave me. So let's see what we can make of it. Just a little bit about my background, both professionally and in media. I was originally a general surgeon from New Zealand. I worked for 27 years with the Christian Medical Fellowship, which represents 5,000 doctors and medical students throughout the UK and Ireland. And for the last 2/3 of that, I was the CEO. And during that time also, I was the director of a group called Care Not Killing Alliance, which was set up as a coalition to promote good care and oppose the legalization of euthanasia. So this was a co-belligerent alliance where there were some other Christians, majority have been evangelicals and Catholics, but also people from other faiths groups and those with no faith who were coming from a disability background. We all agreed on the main issues. I did that for about 8 years. And then more recently, since the beginning of January last year, I've worked with the ICMDA, the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together probably between 55,000 and 60,000 doctors and dentists from over 80 countries worldwide. So I was not a willing participant in the media. Like many, I had it thrust upon me and I couldn't avoid it because of the position I held, that the media started coming to me when I was appointed CEO of CMF. And I did not want to get involved in it. I tried to avoid it, but in the end, I had to learn to embrace it. And I think it's important. Well, I recognize that God was actually asking me to be willing to go into the public square and put my head above the parapet and speak his truth, hopefully in a way that was compelling. And so don't think that because you don't love the media that you won't therefore be drawn into it. But the reason I give the introduction is that if you're going to speak on the media or be quoted, you've got to be someone who has got a reason to be there, either because you occupy a position in an organization that's representing people, or because you have represent a particular view and can defend it, or because you write a blog, or because you have tweeted something, or because you're the author of a book or whatever. These things will all give you opportunities to get onto the media. And I think we all know the current scene. We live largely in Europe in a world dominated by an atheistic worldview. God doesn't exist. Death is the end. Man's a clever monkey. Morals are what we decide them to be. We're the product of matter, chance, and time in a world that didn't have us in mind. But at the same time, it's a world that has embraced secular humanism as a moral ideology. And so a lot of the issues that we were asked to speak on were things at the interface of Christianity and medicine that were also at the heart of the culture war: abortion, euthanasia, sexuality, LGBT issues, that kind of thing. But that's the environment we live in. Then the global village. The world's a lot smaller. We're all connected. This conference is all about connection with 3 or 4 times the normal people number who come along because of the connections we have. And of course, everyone now increasingly is reading and writing and thinking about the same thing because it's all in the media. No time more like the present with COVID-19, where we're all in the same storm, although we're perhaps in different boats. The way the media works, it's essentially a shark fest. And so where the blood can be smelt, everyone will gather. And the people who sit in media studios and make the news are not reporting necessarily on the thing that's most important, or even that's most prominent or newsworthy, but they are all following each other. And so if you go into radio or television studios today, you'll see lots and lots of people sitting in front of television screens, and they're all reading the news that everybody else is writing. They don't go out there and get it. They wait for press releases, and they're watching other news programs to see what's what's becoming news and they're following. That's the way it works. So it's very much like Athens, where everybody wanted to talk about the latest thing in the marketplace. And then, of course, social networking has changed the media because it's made all of us potentially media broadcasters. So we can all have our own Facebook or Twitter feed or blog page, or we can vlog or produce a video or an audio on it. So there's that opportunity that we never had before because it was all controlled by newscasters. No longer. And then, of course, print media has gone increasingly online and has a much bigger circulation in the digital medium and allows for much more immediate interaction. So it's not a month or a few days, depending on the journal or newspaper, until your letter can be published. It can be up there immediately and you can have a live ongoing discussion. So we've got little Areopaguses and Athens happening everywhere, all throughout the media world in which we live. Why should we be involved in it? Well, it's essentially about getting our message out. We have a message, the most important message in the world, and we want to get it out there in words people understand, and the media is a wonderful opportunity for that, especially in terms of a wider audience. If you go on something like CNN or BBC World Service or Al Jazeera television, you could have millions of people watching you. And when I started to realize this, then I began to embrace media a bit more joyfully. When I started off back in the early noughties, it was very slow, but then it gradually picks up. And I probably ended up doing between 100 and 200 different media interviews every year for the 18 years or so I was leading CMF. You get a wider audience. You can get up in the morning in Britain, where I live, and do the BBC news round, and you go and sit in the studio for 2 hours, and then every 8 minutes, a different BBC local radio station will ring you up and you'll do exactly the same interview with a different presenter. And then you can arrive at church at 9:30 in the morning with, say, a congregation of 200, but you've already spoken to 1 million people, you know, perhaps even more, 20 lots of 50 to 100,000 each time for 6 minutes each. So we're talking about a huge audience, and an audience who would otherwise never darken the door of a church. So it's really getting into the public square. Of course, there's the opportunity for dialogue, which everyone loves. And we know now dialogue is much more attractive than monologue. People love to listen to it. But also to give Christians confidence. And you know this when you're, as an apologist, going into a university or a hostile environment, you stand and give a talk and answer questions. A lot of what you're doing is giving confidence to the Christians. You're training them. They're seeing you up there defending the faith, and they're given courage to do the same thing too. And they're strengthened in their own beliefs. So there's some good reasons for being involved. It can be frightening, intimidating, and so we have to realize whose battle it is, that we are the Lord's soldiers. We're fighting for him on the front line, and he is our captain, but he's there beside us, upholding us, and he's walked the road before. So he never calls us to do anything that he hasn't done and isn't leading us in. And our heritage is that no sword against us, no weapon forged against us will prevail, but we will refute every tongue that accuses us. That's the heritage of God's people, because God's incredibly concerned that we perform well and are able to give an account of what we believe in with gentleness and respect. And so he will gift us in the moment and prepare us for it. He will be the one who gives us the words. Moses, of course, said, I can't speak. And God said, well, who's got the tongue? I'll be with you and I'll give you the words to speak. And Jesus said this, of course, to his disciples as well. And I've often been in the situation where I've been listening to an interview on the radio in which a Christian is involved. And I think, oh dear, I'm glad I'm not on that. I wouldn't have the first idea about how to answer that question. But actually, when you do it yourself, it's very different, because God is there dwelling in you by his Spirit, helping you and giving you things to say, prompting you all the way. It really is my experience, and I've never been stuck for words in front of the microphone or in front of the camera. It's God's battle, and he's in it with us. How do the apostles do their evangelism? Well, we know they didn't do it in churches 6 feet above contradiction in the context of monologue and in using the language of Zion. They went into the marketplace. They went where people, their hearers, felt comfortable and safe, not where they felt safe. And they spoke in words that people understood. They dejargonized, used appropriate language, put Christian principles into secular language. And they always did it in the context of dialogue, where people could ask questions, raise objections, clarify issues. It's all about taking thoughts captive. Satan is the father of lies, and God's word is truth, and we are his instruments. So, but that's how to do it. Dialogue in words they understand in a place they feel safe. So that's what the media is all about. It's a place where people feel safe, where we have to be clear about our message, and we will do it almost always in the context of dialogue. Different elements of the media, of course, the press, which can be serious broadsheet or less serious tabloid newspapers, and then radio, of course, the national programs, the international programs, those regional internet-based radio, huge proliferation of radio, and then of course television channels as well, and then all the new media that we're talking about, blogging and vlogging and Facebook and Twitter and so on. So there is no end of opportunities and outlets for us to get involved. And of course, every media outlet, we have to be aware, has a political and ideological position, an editorial position, which they will defend on every single issue. So you need to be aware of that whether you're coming into be involved in a medium that's going to be friendly towards your view, or whether it's going to be hostile towards your view, and be well prepared regardless. How does one get onto the media? Well, as I said at the beginning, if you have a reason for speaking because you have a named position in an organization, or you're famous for writing a book or expressing a particular viewpoint, they basically want something they can put along the bottom of the screen, if it's television, to say who you are and why you are there. But you can also create and make opportunities, and one of the best ways of doing that is through social media. So if you're serious about this, you've really got to have a Twitter account. You've got to be involved in social media, perhaps particularly Facebook. I'll come back to that. And also be a blogger as well, so that people know about you. And a lot of media opportunities I've found have come to me through social media, through things I've written. Of course, you have to be a celebrity for a tweet to get you on the media. But Facebook and blogging is another thing all together. And the good thing about being on places like Twitter is you see what's current, you see what people are saying. It gives you an opportunity to advertise your own material, but also to draw attention to good articles that you've read, and it becomes a repository of data for you to go back to later. So that's the reason I get involved in it. Facebook is one of the best launchers of articles, and things that start off there can go to other places. And then blogging as well. In my new role, I'm not doing as much blogging as I did, but with CMF and C&K, I used to do quite a lot of it, and it does give you opportunities. So particularly go for things that people are talking about. This is one of my more recent ones. Green zones for the vulnerable may be a cheap and effective option for preventing coronavirus spread in low resource settings. So stick to issues you know something about, but take complex stuff and put it in the language of the street so that it's easily packaged for people to read. Imaginative titles which are going to draw people in. Why Christians may eat shellfish but may not have sex outside marriage. Now, of course, you could give a completely different title to that and no one would come and read it. But with that picture and that title, they're going to come if they see it on social media, especially if they're not Christians. This was another, defending the indefensible, 20 reasons to think twice about aborting a baby with anencephaly. And I put this up. I got an extraordinary response to this from women all over the world who'd had babies with anencephaly and were delighted that someone was speaking in their defense. But it also got me onto media debates as well, because it was an unusual point of view. And one of the best interviews I ever had was I got a whole half hour virtually uninterrupted to talk about this issue on Northern Ireland BBC radio, simply because I'd written a blog. That was the key for it. Think about titles that'll attract non-Christians. So 12 good arguments atheists advance against Christianity. Well, I don't really think there are any, but this kind of thing will bring non-Christians in to read. One of the blogs I got the most interest from, or two from non-Christians, were one titled, "I'm Coming Out as a Homo Skeptic," which brought the LGBT lobby in, and then "The Slaughter of the Amorites, Was It Justified?" ? Was another one. And I sent that out with hashtag evolution atheism and sent it to Richard Dawkins, who then retweeted it to hundreds of thousands of people who then descended to interact. So go for imaginative titles, or go for things that you think are not particularly well known. This was a very famous photograph, of course, but the girl in the picture became a Christian believer and has a wonderful testimony. And I heard her speak and just took notes, and on the basis of that wrote a blog which packaged it in a way that people could spread the story. And it got from Facebook into the Southeast Asian Facebook community and just went like wildfire. So think about things that you can write that will get attention. You look at the analysis, this is the analysis on my blog, but the ones I've highlighted: what happened to the girl in the picture, 12 good arguments against atheism, why Christians eat shellfish. People come and see these things and they flag them. But this one here, you'll see, the Christian gospel simply explained. Well, people are not going to come to look at that, but once they're on your blog, there's other stuff that can draw them in. How do you get people to a blog site? But my experience, it's Google or Facebook or links from your own blog, which are the most prolific in terms of drawing people in. So when it comes to doing interviews, first of all, decide which issues you will focus on and which you won't. You can't be an expert on everything. And in my experience, probably 85 to 90% of all the interviews I did were on beginning and end of life issues around euthanasia and abortion, or around issues of sexuality and family. I did some other things, but they were mainly the things that people came to me for. And if I was asked for things where I didn't think I had expertise, I'd suggest someone else or just say no to it. So it's better to be an expert on a few things rather than try and cover everything. But having said that, you can become an expert very quickly on an issue that's related to things you know a lot about. And so you're often in the situation where they'll ask you to speak on something in an hour's time, and you know that within that hour you can print out a few articles, decide what the major arguments are, order them, and then be ready to do something that you knew very, very little about two hours ago. Say yes and be prepared to drop everything if necessary. The point about media is that unless you are actually working on the media yourself, media is always inconvenient. It's always an interruption. It can very rarely be planned, and it will disrupt your diary. And so you have to be prepared and also be thinking and remembering that Jesus and the apostles, a lot of the ministry they did was because of interruptions. They had a plan, they were going in a certain direction, but God, the Father, had another idea and created an opportunity out of nothing. And so we've got to have the grace to recognize the opportunities in media when they come about, and take a deep breath, say yes, and then do what's necessary to prepare. You might be able to negotiate the conditions, especially if it's a non-urgent planned program. You know, when are you available to do it, or when are you available to film some sound bites or whatever. But often you're playing to their agenda, so you've got to play to their timetable, and you've got to leave time to prepare. On broadcast media, it will all start with a call from a journalist who will line the whole thing up. And often in that initial conversation with you, they're working out, is this a person who's really eloquent enough and knows enough about the subject to be on our program, or are they not going to be very good? So they're testing you out, but it's also your opportunity to test them out and find out as much about exactly what they're looking for, because you don't want to go along to a media opportunity thinking you were giving some sound bites to a camera and then end up in a 20-minute in-depth interview with the world's expert on the subject on the other side. And you don't want to be caught the other way around either. So there's a series of questions. They'll often not tell you these things. Is it radio or television? Makes a big difference. In radio, you can have notes in front of you because no one can see them. In television, it's very different. You've got to have it all in your head. Is it live or recorded? Makes a difference. If it's recorded sound bites, you can have several goes at it. On live, you've got to be on top of your game. Is it hostile or friendly? What's the political or ideological agenda of the news outlet? Is the interviewer skilled or unskilled? Is it the BBC Radio 4 Today programme where they are the best interviewers in the whole country and you've got to be on your toes? Or is it someone who's on Sky News as a presenter more for their looks than their ability, who will not interrupt you at all and just let you go for it? Makes a huge difference to the way you prepare. Is it sound bites they're wanting to put into a news program, or is it an extended interview? Is it face to face, or is it I'm speaking to a camera and the producer is somewhere else, perhaps 100 miles away? Every different context needs a different kind of preparation, and you deal with it in a different way. Is it a one-to-one with the interviewer, or is it a debate? And if so, who else is going to be there? And you'll be careful to Google them and find out who they are if you don't know and what their views are likely to be, what the views they're likely to express in the program are. So it's the pre-interview conversation with the journalist is always very important, as much for you to find out about what you're being drawn into as for them to make an assessment of you. And you can also, especially if it's a program that's taking a while to produce, you can have a huge influence on the way the program is dealt with in these conversations. And in fact, you might never go on the program, but you're able to influence the way the whole thing is presented. And then with print media, excuse me, there's lots of different ways in which you can be involved in print media, right from writing letters to writing headline articles. But if you're not a journalist, then you're really at their mercy and with the opportunities you're given. But anybody who can string a few words together can write a letter to the editor. And now, because papers are online, you can produce rapid responses and get involved in dialogue. And many people who go to read newspapers online won't even read the article. They'll go straight to the questions and get involved in the arguments. And you can have a big audience listening to that. Balancing quotes, where you're asked to produce 2 or 3 sentences to be quoted in an article as one side of a point of view, but it's written by a journalist. Be very careful. I never give these off the cuff, but always ask exactly what they want, then compose it and send it back to them. So I won't be misquoted, even if they're only quoting a part of it. Op-ed pieces, op-ed opposite the editorial. So these are more thoughtful, reflective pieces, often written by an expert on a subject, but who may not be a journalist themselves. Headlines, personal interest stories, regular columns will give opportunities for apologists and evangelists to write on secular newspapers. Decide what your key messages are and the language you will use. Now, especially in broadcast media, but also if you're making a quote for a newspaper, you need to decide what the main messages you have to give are. And it's usually no more than 3 or so, because there won't be time for more than that. And what I always do is write them out in order of priority. Reduce them to memorable sound bites so that you can express them quickly and crisply. And then when you're actually in the interview, you deliver them at the first opportunity and you frame your argument around them. So you take control of the agenda. You don't You don't go into an interview thinking I'm going to work up over a period of 5 minutes to my overwhelmingly persuasive conclusion, because you'll never get the chance to do it. You'll be interrupted or the interview will be over. So it's the opposite way to the way you might construct a talk or preach a sermon. You're actually getting your main messages out first. And if you look at the way newspaper articles are written, especially on the BBC is a very good example, the first sentence in the article will give the whole message of the newspaper, of the article, and then the first 4 sentences will give it in more depth, and then they'll go into more detail. That's what you need to be like when you're doing media. Get your messages out early, which is what I've been talked about. The first question is never the one you want to answer. I was on a studio television program on LGBT transgender issues, and I was on the front row as one of the prime commentators or commenters. And of course, they'd given the mandatory 3 or 4 minutes to the trans person who was able to tell their testimony uninterrupted. And then the presenter came straight to me and said, "So, Dr. Peter Saunders, CEO of the Christian Medical Fellowship," almost spitting out those words, "if you had a son who wanted to change gender, what would you say to them?" Now, of course, that's the last question I'm wanting to answer. So, but you can't dodge it. And so you've got to deal with it quickly and then move on to the things that you really want to talk about in a way that doesn't look like you're evading the question. If they don't cut you off, just keep talking. Now, this will never happen on national radio or television because the interviewers are very good. But if you're doing regional stuff or some international stuff like Sky News, they won't cut you off if you just keep talking plausibly, because they want it to be good media or television. So just keep on talking, but don't speak over people or talk at the same time as other people, but just keep making your points until it comes to a natural conclusion or till they ask you another question. Certainly if you're in a debate, the person you're against is not going to be allowing you to get much time. So make sure that you take as much time as you possibly can without appearing to be overbearing in the process. Look for opportunities to deflect hostile questions and turn the interview. Now, sometimes you can do this. It's always good when you're talking to the interviewer beforehand to keep back 1 or 2 of your arguments, especially the ones you think are important, but which they might think are less important or more controversial, so that when you're in the live debate, you can bring these issues out, whereas they might have stopped you going and doing them beforehand. In other words, be prepared, ready to surprise them. Take control of the interview. There'll be places when there'll be times when people, you're definitely the bad guy. You're the marginalized one with the opinion everybody despises, and that's the way you're positioned in the whole debate. But you can turn interviews like that with a judicious soundbite or a stat that surprises the interviewer, that you can bring out and then take ascendancy in the discussion. You will generally know more about the subject than the person who's interviewing you, but you might not know more than the person who's opposing you if you're in a debate. And it's very important to realize that the journalist who is interviewing you will probably have known very little about the subject on which you're an expert an hour before, but they're boned up on it enough to know what the key questions are to ask. But they will be uncomfortable, or far less comfortable, once they get off their script. So they'll have 3 or 4 things they want to ask you, but try to move them onto territory where you have the upper hand and where your knowledge is greater, and perhaps where they're going to be a bit more uncomfortable. And then finally, we're coming to the end of the time now. Just a few personal challenges in this. And I know that all of you as apologists, even if you haven't done much media, doing apologetics, I think, is very, very like doing doing media. It's just a slightly different context, but the skills that are required are pretty much exactly the same. And you'll know about all these things. But anxiety, first of all, if we're going into what's a hostile environment, then of course we're going to be anxious. But that's only human. That's part of being made in God's image as human beings. Paul talked about the fears within, but we shouldn't let our anxieties and fears intimidate us and stop us doing things. The first interview I ever did, that they said, you know, start with friendly recorded radio. And as it turned out, the first media interview I ever did was hostile live television. A dear Catholic friend pushed me off the high diving board to do it. And I was incredibly anxious. And I thought I was visibly trembling on television. But of course, it didn't come across that way to people who were watching. You know, we do things even though we are afraid. That's about faith. It's facing our fears. Pride is an issue, but I think it's a matter of keeping it into perspective. I only have this opportunity because God created it for me. I only have been able to perform with any skill at all because He's given me the gifts and He's given me the experience. And I can think of 20 things I could have done better in it anyway. So I didn't think it was that particularly good. I'm still on a learning platform. And so I think there are ways of dealing with that. And I think often pride is much more an excuse for not doing media. Because if we're really honest, we think, well, I don't want to go into the public square, be seen by lots of people and made to look like an idiot or be humiliated. And I think many more people who could be really effective on media shrink back like the Israelites going into the land of Canaan, feeling like grasshoppers, rather than trusting God and stepping forward and believing that He's going to help you and give you the words. So don't be reticent. Clarity, it's all about learning how to express things more clearly, more succinctly, in words that people understand. And then finally, there's the whole issue of time. How am I to spend my time? And of course, if you're involved in media, then you've got to make allowances for it and expect that there may be occasions even when a couple of days of your life go with a really big story where you're doing nothing but going from one studio to the other talking about it. Or it may be that you're laying aside something that could wait in order to take an opportunity that's given in the moment, rather like, you know, the Lord Jesus being interrupted when He was going about His work to do something else that God had planned for Him.